Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here. Welcome back. So this is the lecture for week 4 of our class. So on week 4, we are covering chapter 3, which is about China and Japan and all of Asia around this same period of time. So this is approaching 1900, the period of time in which the U.S. was rapidly industrializing and becoming a industrialized world power. So while that was going on in the U.S., around the late 1800s, early 1900s, what we call the progressive era in the U.S., we're going to look at what's going on in Japan and China briefly in this chapter. So the first thing you need to do is read the chapter, and you have a quiz this week. We're going to go over the quiz in this quick video, and I'm just going to cover some of the highlights of the chapter to pay attention to, and then I'll go through the quiz questions for you. So the big thing is that the huge difference between China and Japan in history and sort of the reason that plays out, in my view, is simply because of the size of the two regions. So Japan is much smaller than China, and because it's much smaller, it's more homogenous. And by that I mean like everybody is the same. Okay, culture, society is pretty much the same throughout the regions. Sure, there are regional differences, but they're not as stark as they are in China because China is huge. It's a huge landmass, much bigger than the U.S. I think you've all seen China on the globe before, and you know how big it is. So when you have a landmass that big, you have all these different cultures and regions and rural and urban, and it's hard to get a big country like China together. So you'll read about China and you'll read about how the Chinese first interacted with the English, or let's just say European, all right, the white people basically that came to China, including Oliver Hazard Perry from Perrysburg fame, who went to China on the behalf of the U.S. And you'll read about that in the chapter. So there's a little local tie-in if you're from the Toledo area there. And the long and short of it is, as you read the chapter, the one thing to keep in mind, and go ahead and read it because I think the Opium War is fascinating. Basically, the English get the Chinese hooked on opium, and then they build a trade out of that. So there's that. That's a real interesting thing, and also understand that when the Chinese first saw English people, they thought that we were pretty disgusting because we were unshaven. Obviously, the sailors were unclean. They were rude and crude, where China had a lot of Zen-like, if you will, customs, and they saw us as pretty dirty and disgusting. Compared to them. So that is the China part, and read about it because China was really vulnerable. They were carved up by, Germany took a little piece of them, England took a little piece of them, the US was there, Japan, and China to this day are hated enemies because Japan made its way into China more than a few times in occupied areas like Manchuria, north of China, which was called Manchukuo for a while under Japanese rule. So there's animosity and differences between China and Japan, and the one of the big differences is that Japan is much more imperialistic than China. Japan went into China; they were expanding into other areas. China was not. They were kind of old school. They didn't advance and they didn't industrialize like the U.S. did or like Japan did in the early 1900s. And again, it's a very at that time was a very rural country that with no communications, you couldn't, it's hard to get all the people in the country together. So that's remember that big difference is that Japan's very homogenous because it's small and China is very spread out and hard to control. Much easier now, obviously, but back then, not so much. And China didn't really become under one real strong rule until the 1940s when it went to communism. So that's another story we'll cover. So anyway, that's China. Big, hard to rule back then. Imperialistic or not imperialistic, but a monarchy. Okay, with a king and the empress and so on and so forth. And it's fascinating. It's an easy chapter, so read about that. And then Japan. The one thing to say about Japan, and again, I kind of like to compare everything to the U.S. because some of you know U.S. history a little bit better. And Japan was it was much more imperialistic. Much more nationalist, much more racist, because everybody was the same. everybody's Japanese. Japanese language was the same throughout the country. There were some dialect differences, some cultural differences, but religion was tight. Everything was kind of together. So they were very much nationalist. Everyone was kind of pro-Japan. And so very strong country, Japan, and very imperialistic because it had industrial goals. In other words, it wanted to build up an industry, but it's so small, it doesn't really have the raw materials it needs to fuel an industrial society. Japan has hardly any oil. They have some coal and not a lot of, metallic ores that you need for an industrial society. So Japan was imperialistic for that reason. They wanted to have raw materials to feed their industry. So there's a question on the quiz, what's the difference between China and Japan? And one of the answers is Japan's more imperialistic than China. So just remember that. So that's Japan. And the other thing just to remember there is that the Meiji, all right, the Meiji Restoration in the late 1800s is a period of time where Japan changed and they reformed and they modernized. And what happened then, their military was built up. They mandated universal education for everyone. So sort of like the progressive era of the US. They emphasized economic and political development in Japan, and they adopted something called the Imperial Diet, which is their Senate, their National Assembly, if you will. So they did a lot of restorational stuff under this Meiji restoration in the late 1800s. So read about that. And people did not in that area were, they went into North Korea, they went into China, and they weren't nice. They were trying to find raw materials and take over property and expand. So they were an imperialistic threat because they were a military industrial type country. So hopefully that's enough of that. I'm about 7 minutes in, so let me go ahead and go through the quiz for you real quick. And let me switch over to that on my screen, and you can't see it, which is the way it's supposed to be. So give me 1 minute. So on the quiz, while I'm getting it open, I do know that there is the question about the major difference between China and Japan beginning in the late 1800s, and I just told you what that was. I won't repeat it, but it has to do with imperialism, and we know Japan was hungry for raw materials, so you can figure that one out on your own. Okay, the other thing on the quiz is this idea of this Meiji restoration in the late 1900s. It was an era of modernization in Japan. So know what the Meiji Restoration was, in that it was an era of modernization, because there's a question about that on the quiz. Also on the quiz, there is a question about reoccurring themes in modern Chinese history. So as we think about our course objectives and this idea of identifying trends in history, right? So one of the reoccurring trends or themes in early Chinese history is this idea of population growth was always an issue. And even in modern times, there was like a rule, you could have one kid and that was it. So population growth was an issue. China has always tried to control it. They don't anymore because now they need population, ironically. But population growth was an issue, and that is something you would need to know for the quiz. And then also another big picture theme up to this point, our various readings have addressed time periods leading up to the early 1900s. If you have to pick two themes that describe the forces shaping the world in these first 3 chapters of the book, which would be the best two? Okay. And there's some different choices here, like monarchy and militarism, mercantilism and isolation, civil wars and religious revivalism. And there's also one in here, imperialism and industrialization. So if you did the essay for the last module, you might have picked up on those themes, but that's sort of the answer. We're talking about imperialism as we've opened this class in this textbook, and it's no different because now we're in this chapter talking about imperialism in Asia, right? So there's the answer to that one. And then finally, there's a question about the components of civil unrest. And so the question has something to do with high unemployment and poor domestic conditions. And what what happened in China that was related to these poor domestic conditions. Okay. And so there's some answers there: the Opium War, Shanghai insurrection, the Kowtow Compromise, and then the Boxer Rebellion's in there. So you want to make sure you read about the Boxer Rebellion as as you approach this question, and you'll do quite well. So that's what I have for this week. Know what the Meiji restoration is in Japan. If you remember nothing else, it was this time in modernization. And if you're into World War II, we're going to talk about that, obviously, in a few weeks. Well, the beginning of militarization in Japan starts during this time. And you know about Pearl Harbor, I'm guessing, or some of you do. Japan was pretty militarized by the time they attacked us to start World War II, which we're a few weeks to go before we get to that. But it all kind of ties together, and that trend of building up the military in Japan is important. So we cover the chapter. You know what to do. You have the quiz answers, and you should be good to go. If you have any questions, let me know. Have a great week. Bye-bye.